All right. Hi, this is Katerina from katerinaandre.com. And today I'm interviewing Maria Phalime as part of my interview series on breakdowns and breakthroughs going from burnt out to lit up in health, work, and life. And I'm joined by Maria here. Hello, Maria.
Hi, Katerina. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you for joining us. So, Maria is a medical doctor and award winning author. She was born and raised in Johannesburg in the township of Soweto in South Africa, and she moved to Cape Town to pursue her studies in medicine. And she practiced for a brief period as a general practitioner, both here and in the UK. Maria, am I correct? In
Absolutely,
both?
yes.
Great. Before deciding to walk away from your clinical practice to pursue some other interests that you
Yeah,
had.
yeah,
Great. And so you've authored two books, both of
yeah,
which have received awards.
yeah.
And in one of them is a memoir. The title, for those of who are watching, is called "Postmortem: The Doctor Who Walked Away."
Yeah.
And in that book, you share your personal story of burnout and the decisions you made, and kind of the transformation that you went through.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm really excited to connect with you today to hear a little bit more about your story and to have you share that with others. But I do want to mention that in addition to the writing that you've been doing, you've also been doing some consulting, and you're an acclaimed speaker as well in the South Africa circuit, I know, and you've also spoken at TEDx Johannesburg. So I'm
Yeah.
happy as well, when I share this, to share a link to your TEDx talk so that people can watch that as well to
Oh,
get more
fantastic.
more depth.
Yeah, that'd be
Great.
great. Thank you.
Great. So thanks so much for joining me. I think one of the things that really strikes me when I speak to people who've experienced burnout is that those of us who are burned out, in many instances, are the last ones to realize it.
Yeah.
And usually it happens when it's too late, and there's no going back, and all we can do is just stop and disconnect, and it ends up being somewhat difficult and dramatic.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to ask you, is this kind of your experience? Did you notice the process as it happened, or was it kind of like a, wake up call, ah,
Well, it's interesting because I left medicine 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. And I never identified what I went through as burnout. I thought I had failed. I thought I had not lived up to what I should have lived up to. So it's only in retrospect that I've been able to acknowledge that I was severely burned out. Because in my mind, a good doctor puts the patient's needs ahead of her own. She keeps going no matter what. The hours, the workload, the pressure, the decisions, all of that are part of the package. So if you are a successful doctor, a good doctor, you do all of that selflessly, um, and you never think about yourself. So the fact that I was starting to ask myself questions and say, hang on a sec, I'm not doing well here. I'm tired all the time. I'm irritable with my patients. I'm not no longer passionate about what I'm doing. I saw that as a personal failing. I didn't see that as burnout. And it's only, you know, writing my memoir was it was quite a cathartic experience for me. And it was only through that process that I was able to identify that that's what I went through.
so it was, it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because for me, I had a somewhat similar experience as well, because
Mm-hmm.
I kind of reached that point and I didn't know what I wanted to do. And as part of my recovery and healing myself, because I had a lot of health issues, um, I started to I've always been interested in health and wellness. And as I started exploring that, I ended up doing this coaching course. Initially, not necessarily with the intent of coaching, but just, to coach myself back to health from whatever had gone down, both physically and the psychological aspect, the failing, as you mentioned, and feelings of kind of guilt and shame there too, because, working in these giving and helping professions. And it was only 6 months into my coaching program that it hit me, 6 months of studying, nutrition and well-being and, relationships and kind of personal growth. It was only at one point that I was like, oh, there is a unifying theme. That's what it was. So I really can relate to what you were saying. And I think in part maybe it's because we don't really talk about burnout so much. I think amongst doctors there is some talk about it, but did you ever stop to reflect yourself? Am I burned out? Did that thought ever occur to you at all?
No, not at all. You see, the thing is, with doctors, I thought that I was the only one going through the stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Even though, I worked with other doctors in very trying conditions, long hours, poorly resourced, clinics and hospitals. I looked at myself and I said, there's something I'm not doing right here. Otherwise, I wouldn't feel this way. What's been interesting for me in terms of looking back at that time and speaking to other doctors and doing the research for my memoir is that so many doctors felt exactly the same way.
Mm-hmm.
But we were all looking at each other and saying, oh, this one's sorted. This one knows what they're doing. This one's on top of their game. This one's there and, raring to go. But so many people were just struggling. You don't talk about it. You put your head down and you work, and that's it. So I didn't stop to ask myself what this feeling was. But I'm so glad that I at least had the sense of self-preservation enough to know that whatever it wasn't good for me. And, it was that sense that I'm going to die here. Something really, really nasty is going to happen here, so I need to get out. I knew, that's the thing that I knew. And it's only recently that I've been able to identify that I was actually very burnt out. And what scares me, since my memoir has been released, it's a year now that my memoir has been out. The stories that come back from doctors are just frightening. And what's frightening is that, first of all, the number, how common the burnout really is. But what's even more scary is the majority of people are still in that environment. They're continuing, they're sending me these emails telling me how they're struggling to cope, how they can't bear to be around patients, how they're sick, physically sick. And yet they are still in that environment where they are meant to be the healers. But they are very clearly themselves in dire need of healing. That I think is one of the big levels of dysfunction in our healthcare system.
That I also can really relate with that because I've recently written a blog post series on my experience with burnout. And I also got a very strong reaction and people sending me messages and emails with their stories. And
Did it surprise you?
In a sense, no, because, I worked in the global health space and development. And so working on similar issues as you, but not, the clinical side, but how do we train nurses? How do we raise money to train nurses? How do we get drugs to people who need them? And so, still very high pressure, just a kind of different orientation. But as I recognized burnout and what it was for me, then, I was able to see, okay, I wasn't necessarily the odd one out. It's, you
Yeah.
know, it's a culture of burnout that we are part of, which
Yeah.
makes it even harder to see, I think, because it's the
Yeah.
status
Yeah.
quo. So it wasn't surprising that there were other stories because I knew that and I see that. But what surprised me was, you know, a lot of people were saying, you know, I'm there, or I just realized I'm there. You know, just by talking about it, you know, they hadn't put two and two together that they were there. And then there's also people just sharing, you know, stories of, you know, they really got to a point where, you know, were quite literally killing themselves, which is, you know, what I realized in hindsight as well. I was doing too, you know, like serious issues and
Yeah.
illnesses and heart palpitations and
Yeah.
you know just like really serious things, and you know
Yeah.
they were at a point of collapse. And so the stories are, you know, quite intense, you know, and a lot of
Yeah.
them, as you mentioned, are still doing it. And I think
Yeah.
one of the things that the feedback that I got is, you know, I was very courageous to talk about it. Not many people talk about this. I think because of the failing and the vulnerability
Yeah.
aspect of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what I wanted to ask you is, you know, how did you kind of muster up that courage to change? Because, you know, as we mentioned, you decided to walk away from that. You know, what was going on for you when
It
you,
just got too much. It
yeah.
just got too much. I mean, I would try and project forward 5 years,
Mm,
and I just couldn't see myself doing that for another 5 years.
mm,
You know, just the thought that I would still be feeling like that 5 years down the line. I couldn't do it. I knew I couldn't do it. So, you know, it was quite an abrupt exit for me
mm-hmm,
from medicine, because you know, in terms of, it took a long time for me to get to the point where I said, okay, this is enough. But once I made that decision, I was out of there. But then it was an even longer process of working through that,
mm,
because I mean, guilt and shame were the two big emotions working, you know, operative at the time.
mm,
And it took a very long time for me to get to the point where I could talk about it. You know, I'd take my children to the doctor, for example, and I would make sure not to tell them, first of all, you know, if I went to a new doctor, I wouldn't tell them that I was a medical doctor as well. I would, I didn't
mm,
want to acknowledge that part of my life because there was so much shame associated with it.
mm,
And but the stories as well, it was almost, you know, I was haunted by some of the experiences I had in the clinics and in the emergency rooms. And they were just in me all the time. You know, I'd be doing something quite innocuous, you know, like cooking a meal for the family, or, you know, doing something else. And suddenly a memory would come back. This, you know, and I'd be kind of back there and absorbed in it, kind of a post-traumatic
mm,
type of experience. And for me, writing my memoir was a need to exorcise those demons, because they were, you know, the stories were just churning over and over in my mind. So I needed to get them out, to process them, to heal myself. And I did it by writing that memoir.